Weill had a musical background in the sense that his father was a cantor. Obviously, when he grew up, music was very much part of the household. He studied with various people, including Engelbert Humperdinck. And he was, at a very early age, really, when one thinks about it, before he was 20, he was delegated to be a conductor, what they call like a Kapellmeister, as the Germans call it, at an opera house in a town called Ludenscheid in Germany. And it's doubtless there that he acquired a lot of his interest and passion for musical theatre, because a Kapellmeister in an establishment like that would have to deal with a certain amount of widely differing repertoire, operetta as well as grand opera and so on. The key moment for him as a composer came when he was accepted into a very elite class of pupils, 6 in number, to be taught by the great Italian pianist and composer Ferruccio Busoni. And Weill studied with Busoni for 3 years, between 1920 and 1923. And Busoni, it was that instilled in Weill that the model of what he should be aiming for, were he to compose for the musical theatre, was Mozart, rather than Wagner, which of course had obviously very much dominated the end of the 19th century. And for Busoni, the great Mozartian model, in which the principles of both high art, as it were, and popular appeal were combined within the Mozart Singspiel pieces, particularly Magic Flute. And he indeed asked Weill very early on, I think, in their master-pupil relationship, to copy out Busoni's own transcription of the overture for the Magic Flute for piano duet. And so this became a cornerstone in Weill's idea of what musical theatre should be as a composer, to try and make something that had real artistic integrity and real, if you like, depth, but also fulfilled the function of theatre as being something that the public in general could go to. And that was an aim that he pursued right through the rest of his life. It's very interesting that when the great American composer and critic Virgil Thomson, who was somebody who really understood and appreciated Weill's work, was talking at the very end of Weill's life about his last completed work, which was Lost in the Stars, the musical. He described that as a Singspiel. And it's clear that that whole idea, that whole Mozartian model, never really left Weill. But Busoni was definitely the main inspiration for Weill as a composer. When it came to collaboration, Weill was obviously interested in working with people who shared that same idea that art could be something that really satisfied the brain, but also fed the heart and appealed to the public in general. In Germany, he had 2 significant collaborators. Above all, he worked with a number of people, but the 2 main ones were, first of all, Georg Kaiser, a very, very experienced playwright. Their collaborations were, as it were, interrupted by Weill being introduced to Bertold Brecht, who of course also had an idea of making theatre that could both inform but also appeal to the general public. And of course their most famous collaboration was an opera for beggars, the Dreigroschenoper. It was in 1933, when that collaboration had become slightly difficult, that Weill again turned back to Kaiser, who was after making another, what Kaiser called a Volksstück, a piece for the public. And he had this particular idea, a play that he wanted to do, about an unlikely friendship between two men, one of whom was a policeman who had shot the other in the process of a robbery and, overcome with remorse, wanted to make amends. This became Silver Lake. And Kaiser said to Weill, in a way, I think you should make the musical score for it as you want to do. And it's interesting that Weill, at this point, went for something that was a little more challenging, in a sense, both in the way that it embraced various musical forms and in its use of the orchestra, and significantly in what it posed for the singers in terms of vocal ability. He went more towards, as he said himself, it was more in the realms of an operetta, because the requirements for Silver Lake, certainly for the principal characters, are rather different than they are for the fundamentally acting characters who happen to sing in pieces like Drei Groschenoper. So Kaiser and Brecht were Weill's two major collaborators in Germany. When he went to America, he was very early on introduced to Georg and Ira Gershwin, and he had the chutzpah to go up to Ira Gershwin and say, I'd really like to collaborate with you. And Ira said, well, I only work with my brother. But anyway, it's nice to meet you. Come and see this little show that we're doing. And that's how Weill got to see Porgy and Bess, which was then being born, as it were. And Porgy and Bess was a great inspiration to him. And of course, although Ira had said working wasn't a possibility, the fact is that a couple of years later, George had died, and Ira Gershwin indeed became someone that Weill collaborated with on two of his major Broadway shows. An operetta about the life of the sculptor Benvenuto Cellini called The Firebrand of Florence, and a piece which, again, like so many of Weill's pieces, was a kind of a groundbreaker, Lady in the Dark, for which the book was written by. Weill also collaborated significantly with another very, very distinguished American man of letters, Maxwell Anderson, on two shows. Funnily enough, his first real Broadway show, which was called Knickerbocker Holiday, about the early days of New York when the Dutch were still very much in control, and his last music theatre piece, the last he completed before he died, Lost in the Stars, a great theatre piece based on Alan Paton's wonderful book, The Cry of the Beloved Country. So Gershwin and Anderson were very, very important. He also worked with Alan J. Lerner, very famous, of course, for collaborating with Frederick Loewe on shows like My Fair Lady, Camelot and Brigadoon. And they worked together on a show called Love Life, which was like, in a sense, one of the very first concept musicals, foreshadowing shows like Company, Chicago and Sondheim's Follies. And in his great Broadway opera, Street Scene, Weill worked both with the playwright Elmer Rice, who had written the original play on which Street Scene was based and which had won the Pulitzer Prize in the 1920s, and the great American poet Langston Hughes. It's interesting that Weill often went for people not famous for their lyrics. They were maybe famous poets. Hughes was a famous poet, as indeed was Ogden Nash, who was a great sort of versifier, the man who wrote some wonderful, the best comic verse, certainly in America all time. Silver Lake is a very significant piece at a very significant point in Weill's career, because it was written in 1932 and premiered in the early part of 1933. And of course it coincided with the rise of the far right in Germany and the assumption of power by Hitler. And although the piece is a mixture of what one might call realistic narrative and fantasy, there were elements in it in the way that it dealt with the dispossessed and the poor, and the way the poor were being, if you like, oppressed, and also in the subject matter of some of the, shall we say, the numbers in the show that were less, if you like, less narrative and more set pieces. In particular, a number that our sort of principal female character Fenimore sings in the second act, which is about the death of Caesar and how tyrants, you know, will attempt to rule by the sword, but they may well perish by the knife. There was plenty of material there to upset Hitler's henchmen. And Silver Lake premiered in 3 theatres at once, which is quite remarkable, in Germany, in Leipzig, in Erfurt and in Magdeburg. And it was not long before, not only in the press, but also physically, in terms of presence at performances, that the prevailing right-wing party began to make its displeasure and its presence felt to the point where the show had to close. And of course, in terms of Weill's own career, this was an enormous catalyst for the rest of his life, because it was a matter of a couple of weeks later that he was smuggled out of Germany to Paris, where he stayed for about 18 months, collaborated for one last time with Brecht on a sung ballet called The Seven Deadly Sins, which is one of his finest scores, and wrote his second symphony. And both of those pieces, incidentally, if one listens to them in the hindsight of Silver Lake, you realise that in a sense, the Silver Lake has a bearing on those works, and you can hear in them bits of the 2 masterpieces which follows. Weil was a great musical ecologist. He did like to preserve things that could be recycled, but he was also a person of integrity, and of course the recycling was all of his own material. He didn't recycle anybody else's. Like, in purely artistic terms, I think this whole way that he crosses the divide between high art and popular appeal in a quite extraordinary and unique way that goes back to the days he was taught by Busoni in Berlin in the early 1920s. I think that is quite astonishing, and the fact that he was a very, very serious composer, but who simultaneously gave not a fig for posterity, makes him rather special and very, very human. Always when I think about Weil, I come back to his humanity, and I think that's the most important reason why we should remember him, and why his work should remain out there in the world for people to enjoy and to listen to.